Hello everyone, I've been told to introduce myself. My name is Tumarkin. I do it reluctantly, but you have to do such things. I want to acknowledge that we are to acknowledge, meaning to admit to knowledge, to own one's knowledge of, that we are gathered on the land of the Bunwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Gathered, meaning coming or bringing together, but also uniting the land that's never been ceded. I'm interrupting myself because interruption is an ethical necessity, particularly when the task, the lifelong task, is to own one's knowledge of what has been done to one's people, but also in one's name. This is what we're doing here tonight, right? Owning our knowledge together. I pay my respect as an act of looking back. Check it, it's true. To the elders, past, present, and future, and to any First Nations people in the room tonight or watching a live stream, and to any descendants of the Holocaust survivors, and to the survivors of other catastrophic histories, whether experienced by millions of families or by one family only. I'm not a musician. I have nothing musical or near musical with me or on me tonight. I have been set up. That much is clear. I am a writer. What can a writer do that might be hard for a musician? A musician is often at the center of high emotions, especially on a night like this. Yes, of course I'm jealous, but a writer can be a wet blanket instead. Water over electricity, one way to decrescendo the night. A wet blanket writer says, what do we mean by never again, when we know for a fact that it's been again and again? And by saying it and singing it so doggedly in the face of the devastating contrary knowledge, are we making a spell, an incantation, or are we actually trying to wish away the persistence of hate and genocidal violence in our world? Are we shouting deep into the heavens our refusal to tolerate hate, or are we partaking in a magical thinking that is its own kind of violence, a magical thinking which we later might call art or solidarity? A wet blanket writer knows that to every either or question, the answer is both. April 5th, just a few days ago, is the 29th anniversary of the siege of Sarajevo, of the longest modern-day siege in history, of the concerted campaign of herbicide, of the beginning of the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Bosnia-Herzegovina's non-Serb population. The siege starts April 1992, ends February 29th, 1996, 1,395 days, the middle of Europe, 47 years after the end of the Second World War. 1,395 days. All these figures. Out of 1 million Polish Jewish children younger than 14, about 5,000 were alive by the end of the Second World War. 5,000 out of 1 million. All these figures that, if we were to remember at all times, would crush us and bury us alive. On average in Australia, 1 woman a week is murdered by her current or former partner. All these figures that we must learn to live with, which is to say to be crushed by and to come up from underneath, changed. At one point during the war, almost 500,000 Jews were imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto. By the end of this century, the world will be at least 3 degrees warmer. Nearly 3 billion animals were killed or displaced by the 2019-2020 bushfires in this country. Is restating these figures, these facts again and again, a way of burning them into public memory and of making the smoke of that fire blacken the lungs of every person alive? Or is it a way of making them less and less radioactive, familiar enough so they could no longer cause serious disruption to our moral universes and daily lives? A method of making familiar what we might later call art or solidarity. Which is it? A wet blanket writer knows that to every either or question, the answer is neither. Chelsea Watego, a Munanjali and South Sea Islander woman, Associate Professor of Public Health at the University of Queensland, and Emmy Maguire, a Darrenbal and South Sea Islander writer and journalist, are speaking with Professor Larissa Behrendt. All three women are preeminent public intellectuals of this nation. They're talking about Aboriginal deaths in custody. Since the start of March this year, we have had 5 more, 5 in 1 month. And Emmy Maguire says, Australia is extremely comfortable with the deaths of Aboriginal women, men and children. She's talking about death in custody, but also death in the hands of the state systems of justice, education and public health. And Chelsea Wattiger says, this place is so comfortable with the idea of a dying race. This idea has not been relinquished. It's devastating to hear these words, comfortable, dying race. Comfortable doesn't mean you think it's okay. You might feel great sadness, regret, shame, but somehow these deaths sneakily fits into your story of the world. Somewhere inside of you, you have given up your resistance to this being the way things are. Is this not what happens again and again? Why it happens again and again? Cambodia, Guatemala, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Iraq, Syria, the genocide of the Rohingya Muslims, the fate of First Nations people all over the world, here in Australia, the parade of genocide since the Holocaust. Don't get comfortable. I rewatched Zivia Lubetkin testify at the Eichmann trial. You can find her testimony on YouTube. Lubetkin was one of the leaders of the Jewish underground in Warsaw and the only woman on the high command of the Jewish fighting organization. In the video, she is strong and defiant and still young. It's 1961. Black and white of the tape suits her. Watch her body, watch her eyes, her voice, her impatience, the absence of meekness, how she is not contained by the trial, how she is talking to the future. Remember, Lubetkin is testifying about the uprising that was both immeasurably heroic and futile, and she says as much. These are her words that I want to read out to you. It's the first time I'm saying them out loud in a public space. What an honor. So this is her talking to us into the future. It is difficult for me to describe life in the ghetto during that week, and I had been in this ghetto for years. The Jews embraced and kissed each other, although it was clear to every single one that it was not certain whether he would remain alive, or it was almost certain that he would not survive. Nevertheless, that he had reached the day of our taking revenge, although no vengeance could fit our suffering. At least we were fighting for our lives, and this feeling lightened his suffering and possibly made it easier for him to die. Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not going to change the fate of the Jews of Warsaw, was not going to save most people still in the ghetto, and was not going to stop the liquidation of the ghetto, and was not going to change the course of history in any tangible sense. This was a fight about how to die, not how to go on living. A couple of hundreds of fighters at most in their teens and early 20s with the most rudimentary of weapons against the most sophisticated and well-equipped army of its time. As we celebrate the uprising tonight, our remembering must not be washed of the despair that drove it, the impossibility that defined it. To remember is to work against the assimilation of the intolerable past. To resist is to work against the assimilation of the intolerable present. That's what a wet blanket writer wants to say, but also, where does a wet blanket writer get off telling everyone what's what? Anton Chekhov. At the door of every contented, happy man, somebody should stand with a little hammer, constantly tapping to remind him that unhappy people exist. We are here hammering away tonight. A little hammer at the door of every person who thinks no other Holocaust is possible, no war is possible, not in their country. Trans women don't get murdered, women they know don't get murdered, children they know don't get abused. They won't get COVID. They won't ever have to put their possessions in a plastic bag, grab their children and run. A little hammer for every person convinced that in this life everyone gets what they deserve. We're here hammering away. Yet, as writer Mary Gateskill, have you read her, reminds us, the man who says these words in Chekhov's story, Gooseberries, is a fool and a bore and a demagogue. Chekhov gives us that speech, but puts it in the mouth of the man who is not worthy of it. So any chance of moralizing, grandstanding is cut at the pass. We don't get to stay dry on the high ground while the world is flooded, is drowning. Get down, wet blanket writer. Stop it. Let the night continue. The singing and the swaying, hearts lifted to the ceiling, the electricity. It's not sufficient, no, but it's necessary, and you are in the way. Thank you.